I think we're all so aware in this room about how our world is overwhelmed by crises, wars, inequality, multiple, problems around poverty, just getting by. And we do need very much to centre understanding what is going on, big picture thinking, understanding the structural constraints of capitalism. And I often think to myself, in this very bleak period we're living in, can we find some positive things to look to? And I think one of the things which we have seen in the UK in the last 10 years has been a really, really important resurgence of kind of what you might call progressive left intellectualism. People who do not work in the academy, do not work in universities, but they work with interests in research, but they're thinking about how do we try and put out progressive messages about the situation we're living in. And I think Grace is absolutely one of the key people in that movement. I'm sure you will know her from her publications, from her work in the media and so forth. And this book, Vulture Capitalism, which came out a year ago and is now out in paperback, is really, I think, a very exciting way of distilling key messages, not least that we need to place the analysis of capitalism at the heart of where we are today. So I'm going to be talking, and I've got some questions to ask Grace. I should say, in terms of me, I'm a sociologist, recently retired from the London School of Economics, teaching sociology, but I'm still doing research and very active and very concerned around inequality, and in particular social class has been my big interest. How do we understand Britain as a class society? Other countries too, but Britain's a key one. And so we'll no doubt be feeding my interests in class into our conversation. But Grace, perhaps I should begin by getting you to kind of just very quickly summarize what you think the key messages are. And in particular, this book was published a year or so ago. So a lot has happened in the last year. A new Labour government, the intensification of the war in the Middle East, the election of Donald Trump, and all these things. So whether there are particular messages you want to reinforce, which were present in the book, but you really want to kind of underscore them now.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks for that great intro. This is on, is it? Yeah? Okay, good. No? Someone's shaking their head at me. Oh, no, wait, I need to put it. Now it's on. There we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. It's great to see you all here. And thank you for that lovely introduction, Mike. For those of you who haven't yet had the chance to read the book, as Mike mentioned, it just came out in paperback this year. My argument was really formed quite some time ago. It took me about 3 years to write this book. It was formed in 2020 when the pandemic was just kicking off. And I was kind of being wheeled out onto all the usual breakfast TV shows, talking to the Piers Morgans of this world and being asked things like, okay, so Jeremy Corbyn just lost the election, but now the government is spending loads of money bailing out all of these businesses and these big corporations. So that basically means that we have socialism now. It's almost like you got what you wanted, even though Boris Johnson is in power. And I realized that there was this really profound misunderstanding that so many people have as to the nature of capitalism and relatedly of socialism. And it got me thinking about where that came from. I thought back to my own kind of, university career, to the work I'd been doing in politics up to that point. And all of these debates seem to be structured around what I consider to be a pretty sterile division between free markets on the one hand and then the state on the other hand. The left is supposed to want the state to do more things and the right is supposed to want businesses to do more things and the state to kind of step back. And the big kind of political revolution that I'd spent so much time talking about during my work, that of the kind of neoliberal transformation of the economy that we saw during the 1980s, that again was a transition that was framed in terms of this free market state dynamic. Politicians like Thatcher came in and said, the state's gotten too big and too powerful with this social democratic consensus that we'd had during the post-war period. And what we need is to shrink the state and create more space for the market. And this is the kind of context within which so much of our political debate happens today. And it makes it really easy to dismiss those who are coming from a progressive perspective, because you just say, oh, you just want the government to do everything, right? And if you speak to most people, they will know, they will have the instinct and the intuition that a lot of the time, the things that their government does are not in their interests. If you speak to people, and I have spoken to people whilst talking about this book, about political corruption, the idea that they vote for something and nothing changes, the idea that politicians are all the same, right? The idea that basically businesses are often working with state elites to get what they want. And that, for me, is so much closer to the truth than this dichotomy of the left wants the government to do things and the right wants, you know, the government to do less. And it brought me back to my kind of original learnings, I suppose, what really kind of radicalized me and made me a socialist to begin with, which was the tradition of Marxism, basically. I went back during the pandemic and read a lot of Marx and found so many insights into the way that our economy and our society had been developing in previous years. And particularly, I was focusing on a tradition within Marxism, which looks at the nature of the state under capitalism. And this really interested me because, you know, Marx himself said the state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, right? So it just does what capitalists tell them to do. And that was in a kind of a moment of relative unsubtlety, which is unusual for Marx. But those writing later in that tradition, people like Gramsci, really emphasized the fact that in a capitalist society, the state, the government, reflects the balance of power in society as a whole, right? So at moments when you have strong political movements that are able to push politicians to act in their interests, you get progressive social change. But most of the time, the most powerful people in an economy are able to make their preferences felt very strongly sometimes in our political institutions in such a way that means that most of the time those politicians do genuinely act in the interests of, you know, corporations, financial institutions, etc. And as I was kind of, you know, considering how all this was playing out, we had the COVID-19 pandemic where the government wasn't just stepping up to kind of support ordinary people. There was some of that under immense pressure, but you also saw astonishing levels of corruption as businesses stepped forward to say, we want this. And, you know, it's up to you to give it to us because we are the ones that run the economy. There's an example I use in my book of the Greensill scandal, which some of you may have heard of. And I think it really illustrates the dynamics of how the relationship between the public and private sector works under capitalism. Because there was an Australian businessman, Lex Greensill, who started a supply chain financing company, which was basically a kind of unregulated financial institution. And naturally, during the pandemic, his business got into a bit of trouble. But luckily, he had taken the very clever step of hiring our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, as a lobbyist years before. So when Lex Greensill realized that he wanted a bailout from the government during the pandemic, he sent David Cameron to go and lobby and make sure that that was what he got. Cameron, in turn, fired off a bunch of text messages to Rishi Sunak and people at the Bank of England and people throughout the British state. Initially failed in getting Greensill a bailout, but ultimately managed to get this company hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayer money. And obviously, it wasn't long before that company then collapsed. And you can see there the differences in terms of the access to political power that money and wealth provide you. And all of this really brought me back to this insight that, okay, this dynamic between states and markets is just completely wrong, right? The average person knows that half the time the government is working with these, you know, big financial institutions, big businesses to pursue their own wealth and power. We saw it during the financial crisis. We saw it during the pandemic. We see it all the time. And I kind of wanted to connect that with an argument that is made by neoliberals, these free marketeers, as to why we needed to shrink the state, as they would argue in the 1980s, something which definitely has not happened since then. And their argument is that, this was an argument made by particularly someone like Hayek, was that the economy is too complex to submit to government control. It's too complex to be planned. You can't have just one or two people making decisions on behalf of everyone else because it won't work. They'll fall to corruption or they'll just make mistakes. And that's why you need to have a market economy, because that's decentralized. It means you've got all of these different actors coordinating with one another, and it produces this amazing kind of balance and equilibrium. And I thought, given everything that I've just been speaking about, given everything we know about the way that capitalism works, it's very clear that actually a big problem with capitalism is that it is, to an extent, centrally planned. That you have a very small number of very powerful people who are able to make incredibly important decisions over what resources are produced, over innovation, over how those resources are allocated, over who gets access to credit. And these decisions aren't being made under the pressure of the market. They're being made by, by big monopolistic institutions. And nor are they really subject to democratic control because of these close links between the public and private sector and the extent to which our democratic institutions have become insulated from popular pressure. So that was really what led me to write this book about what I called capitalist planning, to take apart this distinction that I think paralyzes our political debate between states and markets that allegedly characterizes the right and the left. And instead to say, capitalism is a system of basically central planning to a greater or lesser extent. It is, in turn, a system that is characterized by a form of oligarchy and by centralized and almost authoritarian control that we all feel to some extent in our lives, whether that's the power exerted over us by our boss, the force that is used against people by the state, the pressure that's put on you by your bank or your landlord. We all feel these inequalities and these hierarchies that persist in capitalist societies. And to then make the argument, as I do at the end of the book, that the opposite of capitalism, of that system, is not the state doing everything. The opposite of that system is real democracy.
Thank you. Lots to pick up on there, and I'm going to try and group my questions into two. One of them is, what is wrong with capitalism? So first set of questions. And then secondly, what can be done? How can we shift politics into a more hopeful, progressive direction? So, and several things to explore. Let me actually begin. I mean, Grace made this very clear. I think this book is a really inspiring rethinking of how we need to kind of think about Marx in the context of 21st century capitalism. Marx died a long time ago. There's a tendency to read him as, not offering many insights into contemporary world, but actually I think what Grace shows is a very powerful way of thinking. And I would also say Grace is a great writer, and she pursues the theoretical arguments through lots of really interesting, powerful vignettes. But I've got a couple of questions around the way you criticize capitalism, if you like. So, as you just made very clear there, what your focus is to say, actually, values of freedom and democracy, which most of us hold dear, living in the United Kingdom, we see ourselves as subscribing to those values. And these are often, as you were saying, these are typically held out by free marketeers as the ones which capitalism support. What you're actually saying is, in fact, capitalism is about the denial of freedom, democracy. And if we're going to be true to those values, we need to actually recognize that capitalism is a kind of crony capitalism, which is all done through oligarchy and planning by the corporations and by the elite. So is that a fair characterization? And also, if so, would I be right to say it's a kind of liberal radical argument? It's taking some values of liberalism, if you like, and saying we shouldn't see liberalism and socialism as contradictory. Actually, they are in fact.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of the style of the critique and the appeal to certain values, there's real commonalities between my understanding of socialism, which is in the kind of democratic socialist tradition, and liberal or progressive understandings of capitalism. Where the difference comes out, I would say, is in an analysis of how to fix things and, indeed, whether or not these things can be fixed. And it kind of cuts to the core of my argument in some ways, because if you understand that portrayal of the divide between left and right that I just laid out as a divide between basically kind of liberal Keynesianism and a kind of, neoliberal free market doctrine, then it's really highlighting the failures of that kind of Keynesian model. Now, Keynes obviously was an economist who was really, I suppose, the father of social democracy, who saw that capitalism was a system that wasn't going to manage itself and that you needed a government to be able to regulate the ups and downs of the economic cycle. This was the ideology that governed the way our economies across much of the rich world, and indeed in the UK, were governed in the post-war period. So from the 50s broadly up to the end of the 70s, we had governments that were regulating heavily the finance sector, regulating corporations that would intervene to alleviate downward pressure in the economic cycle, that would, support employment, all of these sorts of things that Keynesianism rests on. And that was bolstered by a very strong labor movement as well that acted as the constituency that could push that model forward. My argument is very much with the Keynesians and the liberals who supported that, not because I don't think that was a positive change in the way that we govern capitalist economies, but because I think it put the cart before the horse. The Keynesian analysis, and I actually highlight some similarities between Keynes and neoliberal economists like Hayek, who were arguing that there was still some need for kind of state guidance of the economy, but it just needed to be more limited. My issue was that Hayek, and most liberals, and I think most people involved in politics today, seem to think that you diagnose the problem, capitalism creates crisis or creates inequality, and then as a solution to that, as a response to that, you say, right, okay, now we need to tell the political elites what the problem is and then get them to do things differently. And I come to a lot of events like this, I speak on a lot of panels like this, and that tends to be the way that people seem to think about political change. It's like, we've figured out what the problem is, so now we just have to go and do something about it. And it's never formulated or expressed as to who that we is or how we're supposed to get any politicians to listen to us. And my argument was basically that was a naive problem with Keynesianism and with liberalism, which was that they didn't understand, or perhaps chose to ignore, the ways in which what happens in government policy is influenced by the balance of power within society. So the tradition that I write from, of kind of political Marxism, people like Gramsci, they say the state is a social relation. And what that means is to say that policy outcomes, reflect broader social structures. So if you have an economy that's dominated by massive, powerful monopolies that are able to fund think tanks, fund research, lobby politically, provide massive donations, build media empires, then that is going to be an economy in which it is very easy for those interests to influence policy in their favor. It's, not very surprising. Equally, with that period after the war, when we had a more equal economy, that wasn't just because everyone suddenly woke up one morning and decided, oh, we want more equality. It was because we had really powerful movements that demanded change, right? You had a labor movement that was stronger than it had been in much of history. It was backed up by this kind of deep social capital that existed at the community level. You had, at the height of this movement, workers able to shut down entire economies, much to the annoyance of all of our political elites. And that was the foundation of the kind of the Trente Glorieuses, as they're called in France, or the post-war consensus, this period of equality and growth and stability. It was the fact that you had this big, powerful constituency that was forcing the government to change. And that is, I think, where my difference with the liberal critique is. It's because, I see so many well-meaning liberals who talk on panels like this and write books and say, we just need to do X. And the end of the book will be a list of policies. And I'll be like, yeah, that sounds great. How are you going to get Keir Starmer to listen to you, right? So that's why I focus much more on these questions around power and movements and how we kind of build coalitions that can fight for the change that we want to see.
Thanks. Yeah, so that's really, really helpful. Let me just push you a bit with a possible line of criticism. As you were saying, your argument is really that it's a form of state capitalism, perhaps, that the state and the economy, state and business interests work closely together. There is planning, although there's a critique of the welfare state and social democratic planning. Nonetheless, businesses plan very effectively, can be done in crony forms. Think about Michelle Moan's contracts and the ones you were talking about, Green Cell. So that's a kind of argument that the planning is being done, but it's being done undemocratically by corporate interests, by oligarchs, by elites. I buy a lot of that, but let me just put to you a kind of alternative perspective, which is to say that actually contemporary capitalism is also driven by short-termism, importance of shareholder value. So many companies now, they're obsessed by getting returns on investments. You find venture capitalists buying up firms, not having much of a plan for them, thinking about just how do I make a few bucks out of this and sell it on. And you could say, I mean, again, think of something like Thames Water, which if you're living in London, you'll know we have this scandal that what used to be a public utility, which used to provide water, was sold off and under Thatcher. And now, you know, it's gone bankrupt pretty much, even though it's been paying out dividends to shareholders year after year. And so you might say in that case, it's kind of, okay, there's planning going on, but what the real issue is, it's to do with, it's just the shareholders looking for short-term interests. How do I maximize my returns? And that, how would that square with your analysis in the book?
Yeah, I kind of tackle all of these issues in the chapter where I write about the theory of the firm, which sounds very boring, and in some senses it is. But I think there are some insights to be taken from that. And basically, the argument is that all businesses are trying to plan, right? You know, even if you're a small company, the first thing they teach you at business school is that competition is bad. You want to get away from it. You want to figure out how you can make a long-term plan insulated from the market. But the idea of living in a free market competitive economy is that you can't do that for very long. If you develop a plan and it's wrong, then you are going to get undercut by your competitors, or you're going to, you know, face some other challenge that means that you will end up being pushed towards what the market determines is the right price or the right good or the right investment strategy, right? So you can try and plan, but ultimately you won't get there. That all changes when you become a very big firm that is insulated to a greater or lesser extent from the pressure of the market, from competition. And this doesn't happen until you become extremely large and extremely powerful. And what I argue in the book actually is that kind of shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, whilst initially cutting a lot of businesses down to size, paved the way for the wave of consolidation that we've seen since then, because you had asset strippers going in, buying up lots of companies, shrinking them down before conglomerates would emerge. And some now of the private equity firms themselves are basically giant conglomerates owning tons and tons of different firms and kind of consolidating ownership. But it paved the way for several waves of what I call, you know, I say, what was it, from downsize and distribute to merge and monopolize, that you got from that kind of free market, cowboy, asset stripping era of the 1980s through to this wave of kind of consolidation that took place over the next several decades of either smaller companies being bought up by holding companies or financial institutions, or companies buying one another up. And then you got to the point of the emergence of these behemoths in both the corporate sector and the financial sector. And these are the institutions that are really capable of successful planning. Because they are, to such a significant extent, insulated from the market. And that's just in economic terms, by the way. There's then a whole political argument about how those firms are able not just to insulate themselves from market pressure, but to insulate themselves from democratic pressure by influencing states to then kind of serve their interests. And you see this very clearly with, I think in the book, I do use the example of Amazon, which was not profitable for about 14 years. Now, there were lots of factors that go into that, not least very low interest rates and the bursting of the tech bubble and all of the monetary policy decisions that took place after that. But a big factor there was the plan, the decision made by Amazon's founder to say, we are not going to go for short-termist kind of maximizing shareholder value at all costs. We are going to become, what Jeff Bezos says, the everything store. His ambition was to create a monopoly. He said this over and over again. He started with books because that seemed like the easiest market to tackle. And he was like, I want to cannibalize this entire industry and create this one big firm that was both a marketplace and a firm in itself, and then spread out in a way that he's done today to create this empire, which is undoubtedly capable of very effective planning. You see this as well. This is, you know, less obvious sometimes in the kind of consumer-facing economy. But if you look at what Marx might have called the commanding heights of the economy, the industries in which so much of what we end up consuming are initially produced, you see this to an even starker extent. One of the most worrying areas is something it sounds arcane and obscure, but it's actually agrochemicals and seeds. There are about 3 companies now that control the market for agrochemicals and seeds. And this has come about through a wave of mergers that have created these 3 big companies. It's Monsanto, Bayer and Monsanto, Syngenta, and another one, which I can't remember, but it's in the book. And these companies have so much monopoly power that they are able to control the use of their intellectual property, their seeds that they've created. And if you as a farmer have bought seeds from Monsanto and you then take the seeds that come out of your harvest and replant them without paying Monsanto, you will get sued by Monsanto. This is something that happens in the US all the time, right? And it is something that emerges from the monopoly power of this firm, which many people will never have heard anything about. So the fact that these institutions are so powerful in the market, and we haven't even talked about their power within politics, is what allows them to plan. It's not like the whole capitalist economy, or even the majority of businesses that are employing people. These ones generally are not able to plan. But the commanding heights of our economy, the sectors that in which most production takes place, in which most value is generated, have become so much more consolidated and concentrated in recent years that you do see that sort of planning now, I think, taking place to a really significant extent.
Thank you. So again, let me put another question to you. And I should say I'm a sociologist. And one of the big areas of sociological study in recent years has been elites, exactly fitting what you were saying about how do business elites interfere with politics? How do they work together? That's what I put to you, an argument from that research and get you to reflect upon it. So one of the very influential models argued by sociologists has been many countries have these power elites, which is a term used by American Marxist C. Wright Mills to characterize the 1950s American elite. And his basic argument was, in the US at that time, very much along the lines you described, there was a business elite who worked very closely with the political elite and also a military elite. And they were interconnected cliques, they knew each other, often been to the same universities. So it was a kind of very closely webbed way of organizing things. And again, very much in the lines Grace is saying, C. Wright Mills saw that as being against the values of American democracy, US very strongly allied with liberal values. So a number of us have been, including some of us in this room, I think, have been doing work on who are the contemporary elites across many countries. And we've been trying to map, the elite in the UK, also Russia, US, France, Germany, etc. One of the interesting themes has been that business elites have typically operated closely in affiliation with government, and they've valued their business connections exactly as you point out. But here's my question to you, Grace, is it can be argued that we're seeing a new kind of disruptive business elite. And obviously the person I have in mind is Elon Musk, because you might argue he's the world's wealthiest guy, he has more wealth than Pakistan, and he is not operating, it might be said, with very detailed planning. He's operating to kind of basically, disrupt American democracy, and hoping to get, value from that by unlocking certain kinds of elite rule. But not just him. I mean, you can think about the way in which the Brexit vote in the UK was driven by people thinking, let's get rid of European regulation. We don't want planning. We don't want that kind of. We want to kind of allow finance to have greater autonomy. If you look at some of the people bankrolling the Reform Party, they'd be similar. So my question is, what about that kind of elites who perhaps aren't so close to the state, at least in the sense of being in the bosom of the establishment?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously hard to plan if you're Elon Musk and taking copious amounts of drugs all the time. It's probably hard to see very far into the future at all. But no, I think the libertarian billionaires, let's call them, of this world, what they like to call themselves paleo-libertarians sometimes, I think, like to portray this image, and I see Elon Musk as one of them, as we are the kind of bootstrapping, like hyper capitalists, hyper individualists. We have worked super hard to get to the top. We want the government to get out of the way, and we're going to do whatever we can to kind of dismantle the state. And it's complete and utter nonsense. Elon Musk has been deeply dependent on contracts with the American government and support from the American government for a very, very long time. What was the first thing that Trump did when they had their spat? It was to say, right, you're not having any more government contracts anymore. And then he gets into trouble. What I think is happening here, Peter Thiel actually said this overtly in a conference speech not that long ago. He said, we've done something amazing because we, as these kind of libertarian billionaires, realized we couldn't sell our economic vision to people because they just weren't buying it. They didn't want it. They didn't believe it. People like, Social Security and Medicare and all of these sorts of things. But we realized that if we could create this kind of chaotic, anti-elitist model, we'd be able to elect politicians like Donald Trump, who would have the appearance of taking on the elite and the liberal establishment and draining the swamp, but who would ultimately, as we've just seen with the big beautiful bill, really act to serve the interests of a very particular kind of anarchic section of capital. And I think that's really at the heart of the divide here, because I think Donald Trump does represent a section of the capitalist class. Just as I think, even someone like Nigel Farage represents very clearly a section of the capitalist class. But this is a section which is, I would say, much more short-termist and much more about extracting as much profit now as is possible before the consequences of their actions come to get them. And that is the fossil fuel industry. It's the tech bros, who are, by the way, now extremely closely affiliated with the fossil fuel industry because their data centers are using up more energy, than many small countries. It's parts of the finance sector, these kind of smash and grab forms of capital that are conscious that basically the model that they have created is becoming unsustainable, that people are pushing back against inequality, that climate breakdown is happening. If you speak to the fossil fuel executives who cast doubt on climate breakdown, they know what's going on. Equally, the banks that are funding them. And there is this sense, I think, of needing this chaotic, seemingly revolutionary project that is created by people like Trump, Marine Le Pen, all of these far-right movements that are becoming increasingly popular, to distract people from their ongoing project of extraction and exploitation. And I think Musk is a really interesting example here. In the book, to kind of illustrate how capitalist planning works, I have a long historical section that looks at how it's happened over time. And I look at the example of Henry Ford, who's a really interesting guy, often kind of seen as like a hero of capitalism, one of the first big American businessmen. And I show the ways in which he was the arch capitalist planner. He literally planned the lives of his workers. He said, if you want $5 a day, you're not allowed to drink. You are not allowed to, you have to be married. You have to kind of conform to all of these rules that I'm setting for my workers. He was also virulently anti-Semitic and a arch union buster, and ended up being pulled basically towards a kind of semi-fascist ideology as a result of his confrontations with his workers, because he was basically like, I'm the boss. I know what's best for everyone, and everyone should do as they're told, which is coincidentally an attitude that I think is held by a lot of our elites. And I see this same transition happening with Elon Musk as he builds his empire. If you think about, he used to be relatively progressive, right? He used to make a big show about being woke. And then in 2012, he starts having these huge bust-ups with his workers. His workers want to unionize, particularly at Tesla. And Musk, despite wanting to be this progressive guy, doesn't want that because he's the boss. He's the one that should be in charge. And ultimately, over the course of the next several years, he's named by the ILO as one of the world's worst union busters. And I honestly think that this is what radicalized him to the right. I think he realized workers are angry, people are angry, they want economic justice, but I want to stay in control. And if I'm going to be able to do that, I have to be able to sell a narrative that disguises this plan to crush workers, to continue to increase inequality behind this populist lens of, get all the immigrants out because they're the ones that are making you poor. So I really do think that these groups and these men, generally men, although there are some women as well, who cast themselves as the kind of enemies of the establishment and the capitalist model are more often than not actually working to kind of support it.
Great. Thank you. So let's move. So we've diagnosed capitalism as at the root of our contemporary issues. And I think, I don't need any convincing of that. It's a very powerful demonstration here. We see all the problems intensifying. Let's think about how we try and change things. That's the last part of the book is kind of, okay, how do we actually try and shift the political agenda, try and renew progressive politics? And, one of the interesting things, a classic Marxist argument around that is you need the revolutionary party. This is the Leninist model. Led to the Russian Revolution. You saw a version in China. So the revolutionary party will lead us to the kind of the promised land. Interestingly, you don't really go along with that. It seems to me you have a much more what you might call a kind of syndicalist approach. Is to say you don't want you don't want to have a centrally planned political party running things. You want to encourage workers in different workplaces to seize control, which is, I find that very interesting. I mean, would you agree with that, or am I misconceiving?
No, I think you're quite right. There is, and obviously has always been, this divide on the socialist left between those who did, because Marx left it completely open. He provided no instructions as to how this revolution was supposed to happen. And a lot of chaos has followed from that. But there's obviously this strand that says you need a vanguard party that takes over the state and, takes power and control, basically. And then those on the kind of democratic socialist or libertarian socialist left who say, actually, what is required is the building up of people, working class power, more broadly, people power, to be able to take over economic institutions, to be able to influence political institutions. Because again, at no point in any socialist literature has anyone said, well, people have said, but not generally, you need to take over the capitalist state, because there's a recognition that these state institutions don't work and are pretty kind of corrupt. So that's where the whole idea of revolution comes from. It's like you need to get a new state that's a workers' state, or, a different kind of state. And that's where Leninism comes in. It's where, a lot of these kind of revolutionary movements came in. But another way of interpreting that is to say, okay, we need to build different forms of political power, right? There's a reason that the capitalist state works as it does. It's not just because it's staffed by inherently bad people. I don't believe that's true. It's because the centralization of power, to the extent that it is centralized within capitalist societies in both economic and political terms, creates perverse incentives. It creates opportunities for corruption. And more than that, I think it makes the people who wield that power feel invincible and feel like they have to be obeyed. This obviously, I think, will, there's an alignment here, I think, with your work, Mike, when you think about the English aristocracy. And I've, happened to be lucky enough to have been in contact with many of them during my university experience. There is a class of people in this country who go to Eton and go to Oxford and just think they're born to rule, as though, the institutions of state, of the economy, are laid open for them just to take hold of and use in whatever way that they can and should. And that's, I think, a legacy, a relic of the fact that we do have these centralized forms of political authority. And I think for as long as we do have those centralized forms of political authority, as long as we have a sense that there are big, powerful institutions that need to be taken over, even by better people, even if we say we want good people running us all and governing us all and telling us what to do, as long as we have that view of politics, there is always going to be corruption, inequality, a failure of democracy, basically. And I think the reason that people like Donald Trump, Musk, Farage, Le Pen have become so popular is because people are really angry at living in a system in which they have basically no power over their lives. They spend most of their time being told what to do at work, being told what, politics is going to look like. They have very little chance to actually change things. And there's this sense of being condescended to, being directed, being managed, and being stripped of your agency, which is, in some senses, quite a humiliating experience. And to change the way our politics works, it's not enough to say we're going to put better people in charge. I think we have to give people a sense of their own capacity to be able to run their own lives, to be able to make decisions within political institutions, within economic institutions, which is why, for me, the heart of this message has to be, how do we democratize the economy? How do we democratize society? How do we pull power down from all of these institutions in which it has become so centralized, and give people a sense of power and control over their own lives?
Thanks. Well, on that, so on the issue of workers' control, and you have some really, really interesting discussions about examples of that, and some of these go back a long way. I'm kind of thinking, like you talk about the Lucas Aerospace workers, which is a very famous model from the 70s, I think it was, or 80s, where you found skilled workers on the shop floor saying, we know better than the bosses, you know, how to run things. We can develop our own plan. It's a very powerful model, and it's great that you bring it out. But can I just put to you again, it's easy to see how that might work in the kind of the old industrial world of factories and kind of skilled craft work. How would it work in Amazon, or, you know, if you work for Facebook or any of these IT firms? What would workers' control mean when you've got these very complex infrastructures of...
Yeah, I think the kind of the monopolization that you see in the tech space, you know, there's a strand of thinking that basically says you want big centralized economic institutions so that they can more easily be taken over, right? And then they can be nationalized and put in public control. I think there are a lot of limitations to that way of thinking. And I think it becomes particularly clear in the tech space, where you have large monopolistic institutions that have enclosed so much of our digital infrastructure, that have literally enclosed parts of the internet, that have oriented what should be a public utility towards the pursuit of profit and their own power in ways that has just been deeply detrimental to the public sphere. If we think about how much of, you know, what should be democratic process, kind of debate and the stuff that goes on in civil society, think about how much that takes place on platforms that are owned by billionaires, one of whom is literally running the American government. It's absolutely astonishing. That was not always the model for the internet. The original model for the internet was as this democratizing force. It was in some senses a kind of libertarian's dream, because it would not be subject to these forms of control. And I think there are still lots of very interesting projects thinking about how that kind of proposal could be revived, how we could, you know, even like the big bust up that's been going on at OpenAI about what AI is going to look like, what these LLMs are going to look like. Are they going to be open source? Are they going to be kind of, you know, exciting utopian force for good, or are they going to be owned by particular institutions that deploy them in pursuit of profit? And I think we know from the history of the last several decades exactly how that's going to go. So I think the answer to that is that we actually, if anything, have a greater capacity to be able to imagine, at least theoretically, a much more decentralized mode of governance and ownership for the kind of new economy than we might have for the old economy. The thing that stands in the way of that is, of course, the astonishing power of the billionaires that own these companies. And what I try to do in the book is, rather than saying just we need to fight back against this power, which we do, I also say we also need to start thinking about how we can challenge this power by developing alternatives. So I spend the last part of the book looking at alternatives of what I call democratic planning. So instead of having oligarchic capitalist planning, how can we have like democratic planning within businesses, within our local communities? And I think that extends to, you know, the tech space as well. There are some really interesting examples of kind of decentralized models of literally like taking back control over the internet, right? The same thing with media and communications, how you might rethink this kind of centralized model that we have in our media landscape now. And those proposals are all really exciting. I know people who've written long reports about how we could democratize these structures. It's just a question of being able to take that step from theorizing into experimentation. And that's actually why I'm writing the next book that I'm writing, which I've just started recently, because having these conversations and talking to so many people about these issues, and particularly how we build alternatives, the thing that everyone always says is, what can I do? I'm just one person. And it struck me how unique that is, historically speaking, and how particular that sensation is, that experience is to the societies we live in today. Because if you go back 40 or 50 years, you know, workers who were organizing to demand higher wages or to form unions weren't there saying, what can I do? Because they didn't see the world in terms of I and the political authorities that govern me. They saw the world in terms of their communities, in terms of groups of people who would come together and demand political change because they had power. And I think it's that undermining of our sense of collectivism, of our sense of our capacity to work together to change the world, through this just like hyper individualistic society that we built for ourselves that says everything's on you, you have to compete to survive, get to the top, that's how you'll save yourself, has really prevented us from being able to imagine any kind of alternative that isn't delivered to us from on high. And so, yeah, that's the next project I'm going to be working on, is looking at how we replace individualism with collective power.
Great. So I've got one more question left, and so please begin to think, but then it'll be thrown out open to the audience, so please begin to think about your question. But let me ask my final question, which is really something which I'm very interested in, and I know you're interested in, which is about class. So Karl Marx famously, his big argument about capitalism is it generated these class divisions, you know, and for Marx, the way in which you tried to overcome capitalism was through class conflict, really, and particularly the working class rising up and becoming class conscious and then seizing the means of production and all that. So I'm very interested in that argument. And for me, seeing how class divisions play out across history is a really fundamental. But living in 21st century society, how do we understand class? And just putting, you know, and something which I've done lots of research on over the years. I mean, I would like there to be more class consciousness than there perhaps is, you know. And we have a Labour government which doesn't talk about the working class. It talks about working people, refuses to use that language. So it's kind of how do you see class as being a mobilising force, and also, you know, the historic links between working class and the Labour movement, the Labour Party, which have been there since the beginning of the Labour Party over 100 years ago. I mean, there's never a straightforward link, okay? I mean, the Labour Party have always mobilised the working class in different kinds of ways, but that's always been a key theme. But under Starmer, where do you see that link, if at all? And if it's not there, how do we mobilise around class these days?
Well, I want to start by giving a shout out to your work. So if anyone isn't familiar with Mike's work on class, his book is at the back. It's fascinating stuff. Your participation and your organising of the Great British Class Survey, very fascinating insights that came out of that. And I think however you want to define class, the story of the relationship between social democratic parties, including the Labour Party, and the working class over the last 100 years has been a story of ongoing attempts by basically all parties to conceal or paper over class divides wherever they exist. And I think this has happened very successfully in a number of ways. Firstly, there has been, and this was the key part of the neoliberal transition, was that as many middle class people should be made to own assets as possible, so that they ceased to identify with their wage as an indicator of their prosperity, and instead tied their sense of their own prosperity to what was going on in financial markets, because your pension is tied to what's going on in financial markets. The value of your house actually as well is tied to what's going on in financial markets. And that gives you a very powerful incentive to support things that are going to be good for financial markets. It also really helps to undermine the sharp division between owners and workers, because you can see yourself in some senses as an owner if you own assets. This isn't something that just happened automatically. It was part of a much broader political project to encourage a shift in class identification. And it was facilitated basically by globalization and financialization. So whereas once you might have had a sharp class divide between workers in factories producing things and, you know, a small managerial class governing them and the owners within one country, today we have entire economies that basically operate as sites of ownership and management. The US, the UK, much of Europe, and then entire economies that operate as sites of production. So it's almost like that class divide has been globalized, and it's now a divide that exists between countries. The working class is basically in the global south, and the professional managerial class, the owning class, is largely in the global north. And it's been a very successful way of discouraging us from identifying with our class, because you just think, oh no, those people are poor because they're not like us. They have a different culture, or they don't work as hard, right? And those class divides have been overlain with divides around nationalism and race and all these different sorts of things. So that project to basically encourage people to become asset holders so they don't see themselves as working class anymore, and to offshore production to poor parts of the world so that the way in which all the things we use are produced is no longer visible to us has been really successful. I was talking at a panel yesterday with a guy who was a conservative, basically. Well, he was a conservative. He is a conservative. And he said, capitalism is amazing because Adam Smith wrote however many years ago, there are children on the street who are being forced to go into factories and they lose fingers producing stuff in the mills. And he was like, isn't it amazing that that doesn't happen anymore? And I was like, take your phone out. That's been produced using coltan that's been scratched out of the ground by child laborers in the Congo. It was put together in a factory in China where nets have to be installed to stop people jumping out the windows. All of this stuff still happens. It's just out of sight and out of mind. And that, I think, is basically why we've reached this point today of someone like Keir Starmer being not able to mention the working class, because nobody really thinks about the working class anymore. The working class is something that's over there. It's not me. I have my house and I have my pension. I'm basically a capitalist. So yeah, I think that project's been really successful, but it's coming undone. And you see this in the panic around the fact that it's very hard to own a home today if you're young, even if you're very wealthy. And the panic over the fact that the kind of broad increase in middle class wealth and prosperity that we saw before 2007 is somewhat coming to a halt, because the threat is that those class divides will once again become visible. And I think it is a very real threat, and I think it would probably be a positive thing.
Great, look, thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And I think there's some roving mics around. Yeah, would anyone like to? Yep.
We'll start at the back here first.
Sure. Nice.
Thank you. I've got a question that's been tormenting me for years. And I go back to what you said, the pandemic. There's this strange thing and the reaction also from the left, which is first non-existent or confusing. For example, during the pandemic, what I heard, but it wasn't big in the news, Germany, when they didn't do the normal procedures for acquisitions of PPE, Germany spent in total 5 billion and Britain 45 billion. And nobody kind of was bothered about it. Left was distracted. But further back, I've been wondering for years how, and I knew that Austria has very cheap, and from Austria, cheap medical services, cheaper than other countries. I don't know how they came about. And Britain is on the expensive side. But once, a few years back, I was in close to a skiing resort at the doctor's clinic, and there were the price list for scans, and it was more than 10 times cheaper than what it costs in Britain. And for me, this stinks so very clearly of corruption. And whoever I ask, and especially people from the left, wouldn't reply to me, but Austria is such a small, much smaller country than Britain. And I'm wondering whether I'm completely wrong, whether there is such obvious corruption going on, why nobody speaks about it, and why did say the kind of what for me seems so obvious is only my own perception?
No, you're very much right. Are we going to take a few questions at a time, or do you want me to answer? Okay, cool. No, you're completely right. It's corruption. It's both overt corruption and kind of institutionalized corruption. So you will have been familiar with the story about Matt Hancock buying PPE equipment off his neighbor. Like, it's that kind of, basic cronyistic relationship that was responsible for a lot of that excess cost. But then there's this kind of institutionalized corruption that you see very strongly in the US and to an extent in the UK as well. Of, if you go to the US, for example, it's extremely easy for drug companies to massively increase the price of their drugs because they're selling to private healthcare organizations, and insurance companies are going to be the ones that have to pay for that. Equally, we've seen with United Healthcare recently, the company in the US where the CEO was killed. They've now, because of all that attention, been audited, and there is entrenched corruption in terms of denial of claims, in terms of their operations, their organization with care institutions. And that all comes from the fact that you have a kind of what are essentially political relationships in what is allegedly a market system. So when you try and create a market for healthcare, it's never actually going to be a market. The state plays a role. It's it's really hard to introduce any semblance of consumer choice. You have very big, powerful organizations with large costs that don't lend themselves to market interactions. So what you essentially get are forms of political relationships which are just very open to cronyism and to corruption. And the greater the contrast between the narrative around this being a market system and the reality of it being a corrupt system, the worse that is. The US is a classic example. You know, it's like we have a market-based healthcare system. There's very few market interactions that actually take place within that system. It is not only heavily regulated, it's staffed by these huge institutions that have such vast market share. They're able to dictate conditions for everyone else. But it also happens here in the UK. You see it with the horror stories from the outsourcing companies, like the private companies that charge like £40 to change a light bulb was one of the stories that came out. And it's because there is no market, but you still have private actors seeking to maximize profit, but without any semblance of competition. I would say it's overt and covert corruption, and it's worse in places where you pretend that there's a market and actually there isn't. At least when there is no market and you say there is no market, at least there is then an incentive to kind of control what's going on. And I think that's much more the case in Europe.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hi there, and thank you so much for the great discussion. I work with some parliamentarians on anti-corruption issues, and we hosted an event the other day with the APPG on fairer elections. And I asked them about sort of what are the prospects for more participatory forms of democracy. And they were like, we're closer to getting PR than we are to that. Those conversations are so nascent. That really depressed me because a lot of these things feel like they require it, but potentially this is going to have to start from the outside in. And we're seeing that a little bit with the growth of movements like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, which in and of themselves are pretty small, but are already facing incredible friction. And you sort of see it teetering almost on the edge of conflict in some senses. So if this is a trend that is going to evolve and genuinely threaten this vulture capitalist norm that we have, is that kind of a new battleground where we can expect to see some serious friction and some potential conflict? And then kind of the second part of that is you see an immediate issue when these movements arise that you have misinformation, they become othered, they become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. When these vulture capitalists control the channels of information, how much of a barrier to this kind of collective action actually is that?
Great questions. And I'm sad, although deeply unsurprised, to hear that the APPG on fair elections is unenthusiastic about participatory democracy. I imagine that when we're talking about free and fair elections, we ordinarily think of kind of vote rigging in Russia, right? And actually, we know that there has been so much malign influence over our own elections in the UK, in the US, whether that is coming from, Russian bots or all the crazy stuff that people like Carol Cadwalladr have uncovered, or just from the astonishing influence of money, basically, and generally not often money that comes from the UK, channeled through this astonishingly effective and powerful network of basically far-right extremists funded by these libertarian billionaires. You saw there was that conference in Europe of the far right where you had like Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, and then all of their backers from the kind of US billionaire class basically working together. Elon Musk did a keynote working together to figure out how they could influence electoral outcomes in their own favor. And so much of it does come back to what I was saying of basically you sow the seeds of cultural conflict, of these culture war issues to distract people whilst you get this Trojan horse of libertarian economics in through the back door. So that is the big problem that we're facing. The electoral system is just crazy in this country, isn't it? And like every time we go through these periods now, which are going to happen more regularly, I think they're going to start to happen more regularly again, of hung parliaments and no overall majorities, which obviously happened to a much greater extent before the last election. You see this groundswell of support for, oh, maybe we'll get PR. And every single time, the political establishment just stands in the way of it. And I think this comes down to like the key point, which is that we need to be able to form these movements, not just to create disruption and raise awareness, but to really substantially influence political parties. We were talking a little bit about political parties earlier. And I think, to some extent, all the examples I've laid out in the book about how to change things are less overtly party political. But that's very much because I think that in order for parties like the Labour Party to pay any attention to whether it's a Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion or the millionaires saying tax me more. There has to be a movement that is scaring them. I did an interview with the Times a while ago, and they pulled out this headline that they thought was very inflammatory, where I said politicians need to be as scared of the people voting for them as the people writing the checks. And I think that is emphatically true. You know, you have to be worried about constituents writing you letters and turning up and asking you, why did you vote this way? You have to be worried about losing support because you have this movement that's capable of holding you to account. And I think the fact that we don't have that is all to do with this problem of individualism and us not really thinking in terms of building collective power, and instead thinking, what can I do as one individual to try and change things? And yeah, on that front, I think we have a long way to go, but there is some exciting stuff happening. And yeah, I'm researching a lot from my next book, so I am forever optimistic and forever disappointed. It's just like most socialists.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Two questions, should we say? You, I think, are next.
We can take two at a time if you want, and I can answer.
Okay, go for it. Yeah, sorry, I can't see so well at the back.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting discussion. I'm a bit confused, and my question is one trying to seek clarity. I think your central thesis is centralized power is bad. And then there's another bit, which is capitalism leads to centralized power. And that's the bit where I'm a bit...
You don't sound confused at all.
Well, this is the bit I'm confused about, because so we have the billionaires, but for every Elon Musk, there's a Bill Gates that's donated all his money away. For every Peter Thiel, there's a Warren Buffett. For every Sam Altman, there's a Demis Hassabis, Nobel Prize, DeepMind, so on. And even some of the mega companies, I mean, you talked about Ford. I think he was sued because he was trying to pay his employees more money, and they said that's where kind of fiduciary duty comes from, is the precedent from that case. And so is it about capitalism leads to these things, or is it angry, greedy, ego-driven people who are trying to centralize power? And if it's the second one, then that would happen in any system, right? So the solution would therefore change if it's sort of that's the bit where I'm a bit confused. Thank you.
Yeah, it would happen in any system in which power was heavily centralized. That is entirely my argument. You know, there are good capitalists and there are bad capitalists. There are good leaders and there are bad leaders. The question is not whether or not the people who are running these organizations happen to be nice or comically evil. The question is, should anyone, regardless of their personality traits, be given enough power such that their decisions have so much influence over the rest of society? And that's the problem. It's not that there aren't nice people who are capitalists. I'm sure there are. The issue is that whether or not they are nice, which is just random, as far as I can tell, other than the fact that we tend to kind of elect psychopaths to positions of power increasingly, the fact of whether or not these people are good should not be something that has implications for whether or not everyone else is able to live. So in that sense, you're quite right. It is a critique, not of bad capitalists, but of centralized power, and of centralized power in any system, which is why I argue that the alternative to this system of centralized power, and by the way, it's not the only system of centralized power. You know, you see American oligarchic capitalism, you see Chinese state capitalism, you see, you know, USSR state communism. All of these systems are systems of centralized power and political authority that each have their own huge challenges. My argument is that the alternative is genuine democracy. And that requires cultural shifts as much as economic and political shifts. It requires building a society in which we believe that we are able to basically govern ourselves, to make decisions about how companies are run, about how politics works. And I acknowledge that we're very far away from that to such an extent that it kind of sounds absurd to many people. But the thing that keeps me hopeful is that as soon as people start participating in democracy, as soon as they are involved in participatory budgeting and workers' co-ops, in any of this stuff, they're suddenly like, oh, wait, I don't actually need to be governed. I don't need to be managed. Like, we can do this stuff together if we figure out the kind of structures that would allow us to do that. So I think you're not confused at all. My critique is a critique of centralized power, and the alternative for me is genuine democracy.
One last question. Should we go in the front here?
Thanks. Great talk, Grace. Big fan. I'm a teacher, and I'm interested to know what your thoughts are of the fact that I couldn't probably take that book into a school and teach it, given the latest guidance, well, the 2022 guidance, which the current incumbents of the DFE have ratified, so to speak. And the second part is a little bit more facile, but I'm just interested to know, are you a fan of Gary Stevenson and Gary's economics?
I am. I've known Gary for ages. I knew Gary before he was famous. I had him on my podcast, like, God, must be like 7 or 8 years ago now. I think he's doing brilliant work. Gary's we were talking about him before. Actually, he's a fantastic communicator. His book is astonishing and hilarious and crazy. And I think his experiences and his way of communicating is something that resonates with a lot of people, because realistically speaking, you know, a big part of the problem with the left recently has been that it has been led, at least in the media sphere, by people like me who come from Oxford and posh backgrounds and have an understanding of what's wrong with the system, but aren't rooted in communities that are most affected by it. And that is a systemic problem. It's basically because, you know, the way working class intellectuals used to come up was through the labor movement, and the labor movement's been destroyed in part for that very reason. So I'm really happy to see people from working class backgrounds getting into those positions, and to do so, you kind of have to have a bit of an attitude like Gary, because otherwise they're gonna, you know, tell you you don't speak right, you're not allowed on Newsnight. But Gary's like, I'm gonna do it anyway. So I'm very happy and excited to see how much of an impact he's had. And then your first question about my book not being able to be taught in schools. Well, that is deeply concerning for me and from a sales perspective. But yeah, I mean, it's very, you know, you must have experienced this. It's deeply worrying how teachers have been squeezed between this increasing political control that's exerted upon them, and then just a dramatic lack of resources. But the other encouraging thing is that I know that a lot of teachers are getting organised to try and resist that. And I don't know if you're in one of the unions, but if you are, then solidarity. I'm in 2 of them. Sick.
Okay, thank you. I think it's 7:30 now, so I think we should thank Grace for wonderful talk. Her book is for sale at the back, I believe, and she will be signing it, so please do take a copy. Please can we thank Grace for her time tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.